on to our second speaker of the day, and literally we can now zoom into our second speaker, Dr. Ceris Jones, the NFU's Climate Change Adviser, who's about to describe the 3 pillars of the NFU's net zero aspiration and its implications for farmers and growers, policymakers, and others in her live presentation, reaching net zero agricultural emissions by 2040, which is actually 10 years ahead of the UK government target, which Rebecca Powell will be telling you about later. So furthermore, because the UK hosts the UN Climate Summit in 2021, Ceris Jones will also put that into context with international policy. Ceris is very well qualified to do so, having a background in national and international research and industry covering agricultural and environmental issues. She has been with the NFU for more than 10 years, covering adaptation, mitigation, and carbon accounting. She's a member of the Agricultural Industry Greenhouse Gas Action Plan and sat on the advisory board for the UK Climate Assembly. Ceris is also the facilitator of the Climate Change Working Group of the World Farmers Organization and is the focal point for the farmers' constituency in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Process. Ceris, it's now over to you, and we look forward to hearing from you.
I'm going to use the time I have today to try and answer 4 questions. Why we have this aspiration? What does it look like? Can we get there? And how do we get there? Some of the rationale for the why we set such an ambitious goal, both Stephen set out in his introduction, and I think Rebecca was hinting at on the seriousness of the climate challenge. Stephen talked eloquently about the impacts of weather on farmers, and most particularly, most recently over this last year, which has seen an impact on this year's harvest.
Share your screen.
But if I think about it from a policy context, can you all see that? Can perhaps someone could give me a thumbs up?
Yeah, we can see it now. Karen.
Okay, cool. So the weather is a clear driver, but there were also some strong policy drivers. Although under the UK Climate Change Act of 2008, agriculture has long had the greenhouse gas emissions reduction target. It's only last year that economy-wide target became a net zero target. And this concept of net zero really arose from an international climate agreement which was signed in Paris in 2015. And that agreement notably focused on 2 particular aspects: the balance between greenhouse gas sources and sinks, and that's how we've arrived at this net zero goal, and not only our goal, but net zero, which many people, countries, organizations are talking about. And the second thing highlight of the Paris Agreement was its aim to keep global temperature rise well below 2 degrees centigrade, but aim for 1.5 degrees C. Paris also said some very interesting things about food production. It did recognize the fundamental priority of safeguarding food security and ending hunger, and the particular vulnerabilities of food production to the adverse impacts of climate change. And in relation to mitigation, it goes on to talk about fostering low greenhouse gas emissions development in a manner that does not threaten food production. And we rolled all these considerations up together, in addition to the range of other things that farmers deliver both for environment and society, in setting our aspiration, which, as Stephen pointed out, is split across 3 pillars. And so now I'd like to go on and try and answer the question, what does our aspiration look like? So our aspiration, as I described earlier, is about that balance. It's about balancing our emissions with our ability to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And part of the rationale for this is that agriculture and its emissions profile is very different from other sectors of the economy. Our emissions are mostly biological, methane coming from ruminant livestock, and nitrous oxide from nitrogen sources in the soil. And those emissions are more difficult to manage and to measure in real life. They're also pretty variable and can change with the weather, for example, and much more cyclical than other emissions from other sectors of the economy. Fossil fuels, as far as I'm concerned, are a one-way street from coal and oil and gas reserves in underground back into the atmosphere. So those 3 pillars are try and achieve this balance. The first pillar, and I often think is the most important, because it brings benefit for the farm business and for the planet through boosting productivity and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So this is essentially about managing those things on farm which give rise to emissions, whether it's livestock, in particular ruminants, nutrients, both to feed your soil and crops and to feed your animals, and energy. But there is something here for every farmer, a wide range of measures appropriate to the farming system, whether farmers are investing in improved genetics, whether they're upgrading farm infrastructure to improve animal health or horticultural production, whether it's the integration or use of data and technology to more precisely feed both crops and livestock, whether it's investing in more energy efficient equipment. I hope you can see there is really something here for everybody, but there is no one size fits all here and no silver bullets. And for those of you who are cycling fans, this is the business of marginal gains with many of these measures delivering small emission reductions, which is why we need more farmers than ever before doing all of these things to help us reach our goal. Our second pillar, the second 2 pillars fall into this balance, delivering sinks from our sector. The first is making the most of our ability to store carbon on farmland. You sometimes hear this called or labeled natural climate solutions. And here we've looked at practical opportunities to both store and manage the carbon, whether it's in soils, hedges, and trees. And on trees, we're interested in the whole continuum, from individual trees through hedgeline trees, shelter belts, windbreaks, through to small farm woodlands. And in addition to new planting, we think there's a really good opportunity to make better use of what's already there, whether it's letting some hedgerows grow bigger or bringing existing farm woodland back into management. And we know this area is of great interest across the world, not only to farmers, but to scientists, to those interested in setting up market-based mechanisms for offsetting, and to the private sector looking for offsetting opportunities. And I think we're also interested for our members to create possible business opportunities here for them, to reward them for their efforts. The third pillar harnesses our ability to boost renewable energy and our role in the bioeconomy. Again, here we want to take carbon dioxide and carbon out of circulation altogether by providing bio-based substitute materials for buildings and industry, and coupling bioenergy, for example, perennial energy crops, with carbon capture and storage. And again, we think there are new business opportunities here for farmers in this country. But there are also opportunities to make so much more from what we already produce. I always use the example of wool, which is, I think, is the most fabulous bioeconomy product. Not only can it be used for insulating buildings, but also for clothes that we wear, or for furnishings in our houses, replacing things made by or from fossil fuels. And this renewable energy piece, I've focused on the biological element here, but this is an addition to perhaps more conventional renewable energy. We know that up to 40% of our members have invested in renewables, mostly solar and wind, at all sorts of scales. And we also think there are opportunities here. For example, in a recent government consultation on the phase out of petrol and diesel cars, we think there are business opportunities perhaps for EV charge points to be located at farm shops, or linking farms with the right connections to villages. But we can only do that if the lack of charging infrastructure in rural areas is properly addressed. So perhaps I'll move on to my third question, and perhaps it's the $6 million question. Can we get there? Our initial analysis, based on work done by the government's independent advisors, the Committee on Climate Change, and the Royal Society, suggests that we can. The bar on the left-hand side shows agricultural emissions in 2017. That on the right-hand side shows the balance between our three pillars, with productivity improvements and farmland carbon storage delivering about a quarter each, and those bioeconomy-based measures delivering the additional half. Two things to say about this graph: that this is a national aspiration, not an expectation that every farm will get to net zero. And secondly, this is what we know now, that new science and information will deliver solutions in the future. And actually we need science and technological revolution to deliver solutions for us so that it's available to farmers in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time. We think that those will mean, all these changes will mean that the balance between those three pillars will change with time. Although that's not to say that we haven't already incorporated some of those perhaps longer term measures in our aspiration. In pillar 3, in the bioeconomy based measures, we have included some estimates for the use of biochar and mineral based weathering into our assumptions based on work done by the Royal Society. But clearly we need a lot of research over the next 10 or so years to see whether those can deliver practical mitigation on the ground. My final, the final question I'd like to answer is to share some of our initial thinking on how do we get there. So we have a proof of concept. We've shown that estimates signify that we can get there. Like so many other companies, countries, organizations, we're at the very start of our journey. We have a draft implementation plan, which we're evolving at different timescales. And the NFU is serious about this. We employed a new member of staff a few months ago as a net zero delivery project manager, because we know we have to drive implementation and delivery on the ground. And this draft implementation plan has activities and actions in 3 different areas. Firstly, for policy, we know that the new environmental land management scheme will likely help us deliver on part of our aspiration. I think particularly for Pillar 2 measures. But we're really clear that it has to address productivity improvements. Otherwise, we'll never reduce our emissions other than by reducing production and exporting both production and emissions overseas. But this isn't just about DEFRA policy. This is about a cross-government challenge. So it requires changes in planning, requires renewables policy, industrial strategy, and research and development, which I discussed earlier. And all these policies require delivering both at national and at local level. Many local councils are declaring a climate emergency, setting very ambitious greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. And our role is to show what the opportunities in our sector to help local councils get there. We're also interested in some other policy developments that might help drive implementation. We've started thinking about what a carbon price might be able to do alongside what private sector finance might deliver. So that's the policy piece. Second, and as important, our partners. The scale of the transformation that's ahead is so great that we can't do this on our own. And in fact, we don't want to do this on our own. So we're looking to like-minded individuals, organizations to join us on our journey. How do you think you can help us? What is it that you can offer, whether it's skills, data, advice, or finance? Because this transformation is going to cost. And we're looking forward to working with all of you to help support farmers to reach this goal. And we're starting from a really strong base. Many of the organizations across our industry were involved in a greenhouse gas action plan. And that gives us a good basis for driving future delivery. And finally, to practice. What is it that we're going to do? We know that there are things that we can do now. And we've started to think, how might we also measure some progress? Because that's not only important for farmers, but also to demonstrate to others that that progress is robust. And we feel we're at the moment in time that we want to harness the unprecedented interest from our members, not only asking what they can do, but also wanting to understand where they're starting from. And so there's a lot of interest in carbon footprinting using on-farm calculators. But as our members of our net zero steering group have found, this does have its limitations. and challenges. I'd be happy to pick up some questions about that if there are any. But there are other ways of helping farmers understand what net zero might begin to look like on their farm. And we recently published a booklet of case studies, 26 across both England and Wales, across all three pillars and the majority of the sectors that represent our industry, to try and help farmers, and not only to try and help farmers understand what this might look like, but also to give them confidence that some of the things they're already doing is making a contribution. But as each case study also highlights, that these people are already thinking about next steps, because this journey never ends. And I'll be happy to share links to this booklet with Stephen and Julian after this conference is finished. And so I'd like to finish on this theme about working together. Net zero is the only game in town. It is the direction of travel. We think it brings benefits not only for farm businesses, but for the world that we want to live in. And we don't think that business as usual is an option for anybody. And we really look forward to working with all of you to help support our farmers to get there. And I'd just like to finish perhaps slightly outside this theme of my presentation, but just to flag perhaps to you as individuals or as parents, that there are, we just launched a couple of competitions, but perhaps also fit into that awareness raising piece. A couple of weeks ago, we launched a video challenge for young farmers, asking them for a 3-minute video, setting out their solutions to help us get to net zero by 2040. And that competition runs until December in England and Wales, but it's also running for different timescales in Scotland and Northern Ireland. I would urge you, if you know any young farmers, to encourage them to get involved. And finally, for those of you who are parents, we've just launched this year's Farmvention competition, and the theme is Climate Superheroes. So for key stages 1, 2, and 3. And we're asking the next generation for their solutions to help and support farmers get to net zero. And at that point, I'll finish my presentation and I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Very many thanks indeed for that, Ceris. Excellent presentation as always from you and your alongside your NFU colleagues as well. And you finished there by saying how important it is to get the young generation involved in this. And of course, they will be absolutely key, those within the agricultural industry and those outside of it, because many of those youngsters, as we know, are passionate about it, and they will be responsible for directing, in a way, the future of the UK's agricultural industry as we move forward. I just want to pick up on one point, first of all, that you mentioned there. It was really interesting, and this is what is known in the trade as a tenuous link, to hear your thoughts about hedgerow and tree management in its broadest sense to help mitigate climate change by taking carbon out of the atmosphere. That is indeed an important point, and it is something that Rebecca Powell, I know, is keen to talk about, and we will be returning to her presentation after our next presentation by Stephen Penfold, but we will come to him in just a minute, because we do have some questions for you, Ceris, that have come in. If I can just, I've been jotted down here. Some of them, or the first two, I think, are related. And Jonathan Casey, I think that's his name, said, is there no pillar about supporting UK farmers to adapt to the impacts of climate change? I think he's referring also to pillar 1, which is the basis of our next question from John Thorns, saying, should pillar 1 include reducing inputs like fertilizer, fuel, etc., which covers a broad range, doesn't it? And if you'd like to take that one first, and then I've got another one here, which is slightly different.
Yeah, I'll talk first. I'll just quick answer the adaptation question first, then come on to tackling inputs, fertilizer and fuel. So just on the adaptation piece, it is that clearly our aspiration is just focused on reducing emissions, but we're also mindful of the range of other things that farmers have to do. Climate change adaptation is only one of them, but also delivering cleaner water, cleaner air, habitats for biodiversity, being the mainstays of rural economies, as well as supporting their own families and feeding the nation. So we've tried to think about all those things in that aspiration, but there are other elements of NFU work. For example, we're working on a integrated water management strategy, which perhaps delivers, focuses on some of those other things. Then on to the second question on reducing emissions just by purely through reducing inputs and energy. I think it's a balance, I think, that this is not just about reducing or decreasing what we do. It is that balance. So if you can reduce your inputs, whether that's fertilizer or energy, without significantly compromising your outputs, then that's fantastic. If you can do if you can replace some of those inputs produced by fossil fuels with non-fossil fuel alternatives, that's fantastic, without compromising output. So that's the tricky balance.
A sort of related question to that is, can you put, or can the industry put, a price on carbon sequestration? And that comes from John West.
I could probably tell you what price my members want to put on that.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really interesting question. And I don't have a specific answer for you, but I think it's clear to see that there are lots of global initiatives in this space, some burgeoning trading platforms, particularly in those large acreages across the world, in the US and in Australia. And I guess the challenge for us is, what does that opportunity look like in the UK? How do we not only identify the practices that really give rise to an increase in soil carbon, but also find a way of monitoring and measuring, so it gives those people buying that carbon confidence that what they're paying for is delivering mitigation benefits. I think the NFU feels it has a role here, perhaps in bringing people together to discuss this. And if there are people interested on this call, please feel free to contact me afterwards. But I think it's definitely something worth exploring.
That's right. And as you rightly point out, and you have done a couple of times now, there are a number of elements to achieving net zero emissions. And the NFU's ambitious target, and I'm sure we're going to make it. But that's why it is very important that everybody in the industry gets involved. I've said this before on occasions, we can't just leave it to the NFU and your colleagues, and I will say that again later. We have other questions waiting, but we do need to move on, and we will take those questions. Well, some of those questions we will try and take before we break for our short break for lunch, or at the end of the conference itself. So hopefully you will still be with us, Ceris, to answer some of the more specific ones that are still coming in. Meanwhile, as I say, thank you very much for that excellent presentation. And it's up to everybody in the industry to get back to you with suggestions to help in that target. And as always, of course, it's the NFU and its top teams who appear to be, or who are, setting the pace for UK farmers and the agricultural industry at large, whether they are members or not. But we all need to remember that the NFU can't do it on its own. So, repeat to that statement of Ceris's, do get in touch if you feel you can help.